Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to introduce two distinguished speakers this afternoon, both of whom happen to be friends of mine, but I don't think they've met before today. We are going to hear from Dr. Andrew Pinsent, who will be giving his lecture on a fragile inheritance, science, truth, and the broken covenant. He is research director of the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion at Oxford. He started his academic career at Oxford as a physicist and took his doctorate in physics, and then trained for the priesthood, and so went through the usual ringer in philosophy and theology for that. But as a glutton for punishment, he then did a second doctorate in the philosophy and ethics of Thomas Aquinas under Eleanor Stump at the University of St. Louis. And that has been published as the second-person perspective in Aquinas' Ethics, a book that of high originality, which I commend to you, that came out from Routledge in 2012. He's a leading expert in the science and religion debates in this country and indeed internationally, and has just come back from a tour of Australia and New Zealand. And then Archbishop Antje Jackelén, who is, I'm sure you know, Archbishop in Uppsala in the Church of Sweden, the first woman archbishop, and was previously Bishop of Lund before she became archbishop, is a leading exponent of the science and religion interaction in both European and American scenes. And she actually taught at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago between 2003 and 2007 in this area alongside systematic theology. The book that has been translated out of her doctorate into English is called, I think, Time and Eternity, which I commend to you. And more recently, because of her ecclesiastical duties, she's been publishing extensively in the areas of ecclesiology and ecumenics, where she plays an extremely important role in the European scene. So, we welcome first Dr. Pinsent.
Thank you, Professor Coakley. The title of my talk is A Fragile Inheritance, Science, Truth, and the Broken Covenant. First part, a crisis of truth. The question of this conference is, how does scientific practice cultivate virtues? That is, the cognitive, behavioral, and emotional dispositions to act in ways that advance the good of both the individual and a given community. Another expression of the aim in the literature is to examine how the dispositions of scientists might sustain or impede human flourishing in other contexts. If I've understood correctly, the presuppositions are, first, that there is such a thing as scientific practice that, second, cultivates dispositions that, third, may or may not contribute to human flourishing in other contexts, i.e. beyond the scientific practice itself, in ways to be explored by this conference. A further, albeit implicit presupposition, seems to be that the direction of formative influence, or at least the main direction, is from scientific practice to the broader society. Just hold that for a moment. I wanted to see if I can raise the stand here a little. For those who are 6'2", it's not so easy. I think this goes on here.
Yes. That's right.
That's great, good. And it would be surprising if such influences from science to society did not exist, for better or for worse. I have some direct experience. As a student of physics and then particle physics at Oxford in the 1980s, I recall one professor telling me that if a thing cannot be measured, it does not exist. His claim, which I would of course dispute today, it's not so easy when you're 19 years old, reflects the fact that total immersion in a discipline with deep but narrow perception of the world carries cognitive risks. Aspects of the world beyond the limits of the discipline may fade from one's awareness, perhaps to the point that one ceases to believe that they exist. If one wears red-tinted glasses all the time, one may cease to believe in greens and in blues. If one spends all one's life in finance, as do many people in this glorious city of London, then there is some risk that everything is reduced to financial value. Similarly, if one spends all one's life measuring things, with little or no formation outside the discipline of measurement called physics, then perhaps, from one's own perspective, everything is assessed in terms of measurement, and the immeasurable does not exist. Such deep but narrow focus may, for example, be the reason why the late Stephen Hawking declared that philosophy is dead, since from the models of reality that he convinced himself are all of reality, philosophy has nothing to add to physics. By simple reflections on such manifest behaviors, it is easy to believe that dispositions formed in the context of scientific practice influence broader society. Nevertheless, to assume that the main direction of formative influence is from science to society, an assumption that seems to underpin the main questions of this conference, seems slightly naive, implying that scientists operate in Olympian detachment. Surely the most significant causal link is in the opposite direction. Scientists are human beings first, being inculcated with the habits of their society, and then gradually acquire certain discipline-specific habits of the guild of whatever science they have chosen to pursue. Those discipline-specific habits are themselves shaped by society, albeit over a longer period. If I am correct, then one way of seeing this influence is to examine how changes in broader social dispositions are followed by changes in the dispositions of practitioners of the scientists. In this paper, I've chosen to look at the habit of truth, a phrase coined by the famous polymathic humanist Jacob Bronowski, who underlined that scientists should not merely aim at truth as an ultimate outcome, but should also be habitually truthful in the minute particulars of their scientific lives. Whether from his Jewish background or some other source, Bronowski put a transcendent notion of truth, an absolute beyond all particulars of circumstance, at the heart of the practice of science. On his account, a loss of the habit of truth would also mean the death of real science, and hence this virtue is or should be of central concern to any conference examining the relationship of science and the virtues. Beyond its intrinsic interest to understanding this relationship, there is of course another reason for focusing on the habit of truth, namely that truth is in crisis in our society. The notion of fake news, invariably directed by all political sides at their opponents, witnesses to at least one truth that is widely shared, namely that much of the news, including news published by formerly reputable sources, cannot be trusted. Rather than an outright contradiction of the facts, such sources often exaggerate or diminish the truth by selective reporting or presentation. But the classical philosophers will still certainly classify such practices as enemies of truth. I heard the comment recently, by the way, that the last election in the United States was really a choice between two different kinds of liars, the off-the-cuff liar versus the systematic long-term liar. And I'll leave you to decide which is which, but it's a rather bleak choice. Has science maintained an Olympian detachment to such destructive habits? Although there has arguably been some time lag, such that the dishonesty of society has taken time to filter through to scientific practice, the present situation does indeed furnish evidence of a massive crisis in scientific honesty. Among the many specific examples, one can point to the documented politicization of science in certain regimes in the last few decades, such as the Soviet Union, Lysenko affair under Stalin. More recent high-profile cases in Western or Western-influenced countries, such as Hwang Woo-suk in South Korea, who became briefly the country's most famous scientist for claiming that he had managed to clone human beings. It's all found to be false afterwards. In addition, there's been the inability to replicate many scientific results, especially in highly interpretation-laden disciplines such as psychology, and the tendency to mass out reports, especially when a great deal of money and power are at stake. To give one simple and recent example of massive public misinformation, in December 2017, National Geographic, a sober and respected magazine founded to increase and diffuse geographic knowledge, published an article showing a video of a starving polar bear in the Canadian Arctic, with the headline, "This is what climate change looks like." People took the article literally, and the video became the most watched ever on the National Geographic website. I checked this morning, 1.606 million views. When follow-up coverage is added, it is estimated that 2.5 billion people were reached by the footage. The problem, as National Geographic has admitted this month, if you look at this month's edition, is that what was depicted by the gut-wrenching images cannot, taken in isolation, be linked to climate change. The mortality rate for mammals is, as it has always been, without special divine action, 100%, and polar bears die all the time. Moreover, though reports about polar bears are full of future contingent dire warnings and woes, it turns out when you delve a little deeper to be surprisingly hard to establish accurately whether polar bear populations are declining at the moment. Following extensive aerial surveys in July 2016, the reassessment of the Baffin Bay and Cane Basin polar bear subpopulations, final report to the Canada-Greenland Joint Commission on Polar Bears, this is the whole world, by the way, counted by aerial surveys, note, which is the most accurate way of doing it, 357 polar bears over those regions instead of 224 in the 1990s, showing an increase of 130. At the very least, the spin and the stories are running well ahead and to some extent in the opposite direction of such limited data as we have. And it should also be noted in passing, proponents of so-called post-normal science welcome this development in situations in which, quote, facts are uncertain, values in dispute, stakes high, and decisions urgent, end of quote. More generally, Bruce Carlton, a professional scientist who has published what he himself calls an angry book about the state of science, the title is Not Even Trying, The Corruption of Real Science, has summed up the situation as follows, open quote, in modern professional research, there is just enough narrowly factual accuracy to render deniable its basic and motivated dishonesty, close of quote. The phrase, just enough narrowly factual accuracy, implies that even if science is not permeated by many instances of formal contradictions of facts or falsifications of data, there are still many instances in which false understandings of the world are communicated with the purloined authority of science. Whatever else may be said, such habits are not what Bronowski meant by the habit of truth. And whatever short-term expedient advantages may result, in terms of money, influence, power, whatever, the gradual erosion of trust is unlikely to be beneficial in the longer term. Indeed, even in the short term, when false understandings are communicated with the authority of science, the purloined authority of science, and used as a basis for policy decisions, the outcomes can and sometimes have been absolutely disastrous. So where does the habit of truth come from? Why is it being eroded, and what can be done? I begin by asking a more basic question. In what framework of human flourishing is truth a genuine virtue? Next section, title, Truth as a Virtue. The notion of truth as an absolute value is not absent from classical philosophy, expressed especially clearly in the following text from the Nicomachean Ethics. It's the Barnes translation. And falsehood is in itself mean and culpable, and truth noble and worthy of praise. Thus the truthful man is another case of a man who, being in the mean, is worthy of praise, and both forms of untruthful man are culpable, and particularly the boastful man. Close of quote. In this text, Aristotle refers to the nobility and praiseworthiness of truth in opposition to those who overstate or understate the truth. It should also be noted that Aristotle stresses that the truthful person is truthful not simply in terms of large matters, such as faith in agreements, but also when nothing is at stake. As noted previously, this notion of habitual truthfulness in minute particulars, not only ultimate outcomes, is one of the characteristics that Bronowski emphasizes as important in science. In a Judeo-Christian context, truthfulness becomes even more important, giving additional emphasis by the association of lying directly with Satan himself, who is portrayed as a liar in the Old Testament and described in the New Testament as the father of lies, John 8:44, Revelation 12:9. In the Theological Anthropology of St. Thomas Aquinas, truth is labelled explicitly as a virtue and described in the Summa, Secunda Secundae 109 to 113, where it is connected with the virtue of justice. Although there are some points of similarity with the treatment of truth in a Nicomachean ethics, Aquinas lists additional states of character that are opposed to truth, including direct contradiction of the truth, lying, and hypocrisy, that is, seeming to be what one is not. What is also striking is that 6 of the 10 articles of those questions are explicitly about whether and to what extent the actions of those vices opposed to truth are not just vices but sins. Indeed, 3 of the 6 articles examine the question of whether the acts associated with these vices are mortal sins. A characteristic of a single mortal sin, according to Aquinas, is that it expels or cuts off the infused virtues and the associated dispositions and gifts of the Holy Spirit. On this account, a single instance of at least some kinds of serious falsehood will not only cause persons to lose nobility and praise, as in the Aristotelian account, but will, without repentance and restoration of grace, put persons in hell for all eternity. Quite strong, I think. Even such strong claims, expressed in abstract terms, often fail to bring home what is at stake in a transcendent understanding of truth. Using narrative to appreciate better what is at stake, consider, for instance, the following quotation of St. Thomas More, taken from the play A Man for All Seasons. At this point in the play, Sir Thomas is being pressured by many people, including even his family and friends, to take the oath of supremacy, to swear allegiance to the monarch as supreme governor of the Church of England, an oath still required of students at Oxford until 1854. More could take a pragmatic stance and take the oath while continuing to believe in his heart that it's false. In fact, he's offered this opportunity while in prison. But he responds to this suggestion as follows. This is to his daughter Meg, open quotation. When a man takes an oath, Meg, he's holding his own self in his hands, like water. He cups his hands. If he opens his fingers, then he needn't hope to find himself again. Close of quotation. By means of this image of water pouring from opened fingers, the figure of More in the play is underlining how the seriousness of oath-taking, namely that taking an oath falsely will lead to the loss of his soul beyond hope, or at least human hope of recovery. Although More is referring explicitly to taking an oath, the sense being conveyed is that he regards truth in general as transcendent. Today, Thomas More is regarded as a saint and martyr, widely admired beyond the Catholic Church. When in the year 2000, the Church also named him as patron saint of politicians, I had the honour of carrying the ceremonial cross into St. Peter's Square for the Mass. And I recognized one of the guests as Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. In other words, the influence of More's life is so great that roughly 5 centuries after his death, he was honoured by the presence of the last leader of the world's first atheist state at a solemn Mass in St. Peter's Square. I mean, it was amazing, and the BBC missed all of it. Nothing reported on the media, but I was there, I saw it. Believe me, it's true. Without the benefit of hindsight, More faced powerful arguments against his stance in the last months of his life. He could have taken a more pragmatic course, signing the oath and returning home to support his family, and many did, by the way, take the more pragmatic course. He could have regained influence in court, acting as a counterweight to the growing power of Cromwell. From this position, he might even have helped to save some of England's monasteries, over 800 of which were shortly to be plundered and destroyed. Indeed, many others of his time, including the majority of bishops, went along with the king's desires, not only with a desire to avoid personal suffering, but to stay alive to do what they could to defend justice. The point I'm trying to emphasize is this: More's commitment to transcendent truth was unreasonable by the standards of most people's reason, and certainly by most people's reasoning today. After all, who speaks like More in the passage above today? Who regards truth as a matter of holding one's soul in one's hands, such as a single falsehood can lead to a loss of oneself? By what standard, by what account of human flourishing, was More in fact being reasonable? To approach this question, it's important to consider that the key principle of Christian flourishing, recapitulated from Judaism, is not a refined version of biological flourishing, as in the Nicomachean ethics. Indeed, in Christianity, a person can even be crucified and yet be said to flourish, because the key to flourishing in a life of grace is a transcendent covenant. The meaning of covenant has many complex overtones, but the key principle is that the relationship between the parties is particular, of I to thou, a kind of spiritual friendship or marriage. On this account, a virtue is what contributes to the flourishing of this relationship, and such infused virtues are not merely opposed by vice, but by the special category of sin, a singular action that can cause the breaking of a covenant, i.e. an act of spiritual adultery. On this account, why then is veracity so important? If the meaning of flourishing involves harmony with a second person, principally in Christianity the person of God the Holy Spirit, the problem with lying is that there is an implicit contradiction, an internal disharmony between what one is or thinks and what one manifests or speaks. And if there is such an internal disharmony in oneself, then there is not a coherent self with which another person can be united. And to give a more prosaic example, I was teaching virtue ethics in America to college-age students, and by and large they were complete pragmatists about truth. They thought lying was okay, but they didn't like the idea of being lied to in a relationship. That's the only way I could get through to the idea of transcendent truth. So you can't, or to put the claim in more prosaic terms, one cannot be friends with a liar. Hence, the Judeo-Christian tradition has emphasized truth as transcendent, not simply because it's noble and praiseworthy, though it is, but because a person has to have the virtue of truth to be capable of a relationship of covenant, a spiritual marriage to God, as it were. Next section, the broken covenant. What then has happened to society? Why and how has the transcendence of truth been lost? The dying embers of shame over falsehood are still being weaponized for use against enemies, but even these weapons are losing their force as the residual sense of shame dissolves. Words with an indifference to truth or falsity are treated increasingly in a pragmatic manner to achieve desirable ends. And the decay of truth in society has spread, albeit with some delay, into the practice of science. How far back does this decay go? To return to the example of St. Thomas More, the context of his sacrifice for truth was the truth of a marriage. Like King Henry VIII, who had married Catherine of Aragon in 1509, had no right to dissolve that marriage to marry another woman. When Pope Clement VII refused to annul the marriage, Henry defied him by assuming supremacy over religious matters and having the marriage to Catherine declared invalid in 1533. Instead, Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon for a long time, and she never ceased to refer to Henry as her beloved husband. Henry subsequently officially married Anne Boleyn, whom he had already married in secret. Just a few years later, in 1536, Anne was beheaded, but by then the chain reaction of the Reformation was well underway. When the English Reformation is described in England, it's often presented in political terms. The initial motivation, it is said, was not really doctrinal, but a matter of pragmatism, power, and money. But I think that such assessments are mistaken, because although Henry still believed himself to be a faithful Catholic, the issue of dissolution of a marriage, of turning marriage from something transcendent into something more like a practical contract, struck at the heart of the image of covenant. In other words, the primary image of the spiritual marriage of God and his people. What relatively few people know today is that there was a close parallel in Germany to the affairs of Henry VIII. I want to be corrected on this later, so I'm very happy to be corrected. One of the earliest and most powerful champions of the Reformation, Philip I, Landgrave of Hesse, had an undesirable wife and considered as early as 1526 the possibility of bigamy. He'd already dabbled in adultery quite a lot. He accordingly wrote to Martin Luther for his opinion about the matter, alleging as a precedent the polygamy of the patriarchs. Luther initially refused, but faced with the possible defection of the Landgrave, Luther and Melanchthon filed a joint opinion on 10th of December 1539 that a dispensation could be granted from the general law that a man could not have more than one wife. Accordingly, Philip married again to a woman called Margaret, and subsequently lived with both wives, both of whom bore him children. Both the official Landgrave's wife, 2 sons and a daughter, and Margaret bore 6 sons. Of course, Luther was under enormous pressure to consent to bigamy, given that the very future of the Reformation was at stake. He and Melanchthon also tried, without success, to keep the whole affair a secret. It is in this context that Luther advised the Landgrave publicly to deny the second marriage with the following words that have become infamous. Open quotation. What harm would it do if a man told a good strong lie for the sake of the good and for the Christian church? A lie out of necessity, a useful lie, a helpful lie. Such lies would not be against God, he would accept them. Close of quote. I'm going to accuse my own church soon, so don't worry. Such a statement should not be taken to infer that Luther was a habitual liar, or that he rejected the habit of truth in the ordinary, everyday sense of habitually telling the truth. But by conceding to the desires of Philip of Hesse, he did in effect deny the truth of Philip's marriage vows, and in attempting to hide the fact of that concession, he also made the claim that lying will be justified to serve that end. In other words, according to Luther, one could be a Christian with a general habit of truth, but without the habit of the truth in the transcendent sense, when faced by extreme need. And lest you think I'm just getting at the Lutherans, I have to quote that a Catholic Archbishop just a few days ago said that truth is not a fixed dimension. This is a man who clearly wants to forget about some of the other truths of the faith. So, no, it's spread everywhere, I'm afraid. Moreover, the circumstance, namely of fidelity to marriage, is also significant, even if it only seemed accidental at the time. Many subsequent articulations of Protestantism went on to deny the sacramentality of marriage, including the 39 Articles of the Church of England. I have to say, many non-Catholics do actually believe in the sacramentality of marriage and the covenant of marriage, but anyway, it's not there officially. With the loss of the sense of the transcendence of marriage, often subsequently reduced to a contract rather than the covenant, the primary metaphor of the relationship with God has also faded to a matter of expedience. And expedience, unlike covenant, is compatible with falsehood. Hence, it is not surprising that the erosion of marriage and the erosion of truth have unfolded in our society more or less in concert. Conclusion. We live at a time of a crisis of truth in society, and evidence suggests that science is not immune from this crisis. On the contrary, without a transcendent understanding of truth, it seems improbable that anything will stand in the way of expedience, money, and power. This crisis is not, I think, ultimately one of science, or philosophy, or society, but theology. When people still thought of theological flourishing as an unbreakable covenant with God, where one puts one's soul in one's hands, then the commitment to transcendent truth was an intrinsic part of that flourishing. When the covenant was broken, one expression being the reduction of covenantal marriage to a breakable contract, then truth also began to decay. The roots of these developments go far back into our history, and it would be unwise to claim that any one person or factor is exclusively responsible. Nevertheless, like the breaking of a seal, or the removal of a keystone from an arch, or the betrayal of a marriage, the initial lie can be quite small, but can start a chain reaction. And when lying is condoned by someone who has assumed the mantle of religious authority and widely acknowledged as such, then the effects can be catastrophic. Thank you very much.